Hey everybody, I'm with John, aka the Godless Engineer, and it's kind of an unlikely conversation. We're going to be talking today about undesigned coincidences. John is, to say, not a fan of the argument, and we're going to just have a friendly discussion. And are there undesigned coincidences in the Gospels, and what's the implications of that? What's his take on it? And just be like a friendly kind of back and forth, not some kind of serious debate or anything else like that. We'll probably go for about 45 minutes or so. And if you have questions, we'll try and save them to the end. So if you want to send some questions, feel free to do that. Super chats will get priority, but we'll answer questions if we have the time for any others. So anyways, John, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. And I just have to say that, I'm not convinced by the undesigned coincidences. So you're just going to need to deal with it.
Okay. I appreciate that. All right, man. That was the surprise. Okay. He was warned me ahead of the broadcast. He's got a surprise. And I was like, oh man, he wouldn't tell me what it was. So those are pretty sweet.
Well, I mean, I know how much you like to use this in your thumbnails. So I thought that could be a fun little thing to share, before we started, I guess to give us this air of just, a light discussion, no bad intentions on my part or anything like that. I'm just here for a good discussion.
Yeah, for sure. And the way I feel about these things is like, when you get online and you get on YouTube, there's just kind of a different kind of flavor. But when you can kind of discuss things face to face, my understanding is just my philosophy, I guess you'd say, is just, why can't we just enjoy nerdy things together? These are fun things to talk about and discuss. That's why we spend so much time on them. And I feel like even though we have like major differences, I think just the fact that we can enjoy these kind of conversations is something that can unite us. And so, so undesigned coincidences. I'm going to jump into a very brief presentation. People have probably seen my video. John has responded a long time ago to some of my videos on this, and we're just now being able to kind of connect here finally. But I'm going to just run through a very quick explanation of undesigned coincidences and give a few examples. And then I'm going to just kind of let John respond, and then we'll just kind of go back and forth from there. And so undesigned coincidences, what are they? Let me mess with my slides here. Hopefully I got it right. An undesigned coincidence is basically sometimes two works by different authors interlock in a way that would be very unlikely if one of them were copied from the other completely, or they were both completely copied from a common source. So for example, one book may mention in passing a detail that answers some question raised by another, and the two records fit together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. And so one of the examples, kind of like a real life example that Dr. Lydia McGrew, who's kind of more revived the argument from undesigned coincidences and popularized it in her book, Hidden in Plain View, she talks about like a couple of friends meeting together in a coffee house to discuss maybe some, like, they have a serious confession that they need to make to one of their friends, and they're telling it the story about this confession later, and one of them happens to mention in passing that the coffee house was like extremely busy, and then the other person mentions in passing that they spilled their coffee and got coffee all over their lap or something like that. And so these particular details fit together because if a coffee house is really busy, there's a chance that somebody could bump into that person, leading to the spilled coffee, kind of dovetail one with another. And it looks more like something that's better explained as if they're telling the truth about what was their conversation was about versus, them just kind of making up some sort of like story or lying or something like that. And so a few examples, I'm going to talk about the feeding of the 5,000, because this is what GE responded to in my video here. I think that the evidence for the feeding of the 5,000 is probably one of the better attested miracles in the gospel, aside from the resurrection. Of course, GE would dispute both of those pretty vehemently. That's why he showed up. My prayers did not work. He showed up. He did not convert before this happened. But anyways, I'm going to quote Matthew 11:21. It says, "Woe to you, Chorazin, woe to you, Bethsaida, for if the mighty works done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes." Now, what exactly is this comment about from Jesus? He hasn't really mentioned, like this just kind of comes up out of nowhere in Matthew. And so just kind of hold that one in your mind. This is John 6:5. Lifting up his eyes then and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, where are we to buy bread that these people may eat? Okay, so if you're making up a gospel story, why exactly would you use Philip? Like when you're thinking about buying bread, who would have the money bag? Well, maybe Judas or something like that. Or why didn't he ask Peter? Peter's like the most prominent character of all people, right? Philip is a pretty obscure character. And so we find out later from reading in John that Philip was actually from Bethsaida in Galilee. Okay, this is in John 12:21, also in John 1:44. Now Luke tells us that on their return, the disciples or the apostles told them all that they had done, and they took them and withdrew apart from them a town called Bethsaida. And when the crowds learned it, they followed him. So this is Luke 9, 10 and 11. And so, I hit back instead of forward. So Luke doesn't mention Philip at all. And John and Matthew doesn't mention Bethsaida as the location of the feeding of the 5,000. And so now you can see why Jesus was so harsh with Bethsaida, because such an amazing miracle had taken place there. Even though the feeding of the 5,000 isn't mentioned in Matthew, he talks about it later in the 14th chapter. Okay, so all of these pieces interlock like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. That's just like one example. There's more in the feeding of the 5,000. And I'm going to try and buzz through these super quick just so that we can get to the discussion. Mark 6:31 and 39, and he said to them, come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while, for many were coming and going. I don't know where John went here. Let me make sure I can get him back here. There he is. For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure to eat. And then he commanded them to sit in groups of the green grass. Okay, so Mark is just mentioning that there's a bunch of people there, there's a big crowd, and that there happens to be green grass, right? Now, John, in John chapter 6 and verse 4, says that it was Passover time. The feast of the Jews was at hand, right? Now, if you know anything about topography in Palestine in this particular, the grass is not normally green. The grass is normally brown. This is a picture of the grass. Normally, it's only during the rainy season do we get green grass. Well, John happens to mention that the feeding of the 5,000 takes place during Passover. Well, that explains all of a sudden the large crowds, because people are coming from all over the diaspora to celebrate the Passover, right? And then also the grass is green because that's the rainy season of that particular time. And so again, these pieces fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. Mark doesn't mention the Passover. John doesn't mention the crowds. And so these things kind of fit together. I'm only going to give one more example, but I want to pause here and just take a second to reflect here. Why exactly is this important? Well, one undesigned coincidence, it might be an accident, right? It just could be by mistake. These could just be like two unrelated pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that fit together by chance. The problem is, I would say for the skeptical side, is that if we discover a number of undesigned coincidences that crisscross across all of the documents, and then it becomes too absurd to insist that they're all just like accidental. Okay. Now, one other thing that I'll add here is that in J.J. Blunt's book, which is the one that focuses more on undesigned coincidences in the Gospels, I believe he gives like 60 different examples. Lydia McGrew gives 27 different examples. Okay, and so it's a cumulative case. It's not just like, well, one of these might be an accident and I can explain it because of this or that. It's that there's a multitude of them. I'm only going to give one more example just for the sake of time, because I've already gone for 10 minutes here. But this is a favorite of mine. It says in Matthew 14:2-3, it says, at that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard about the fame of Jesus, and he said to his servants, this is John the Baptist. He has been raised from the dead. That is why these miraculous powers are at work in him. And so it's only in Matthew's gospel that we hear that Herod says something to his servants about who he thinks Jesus is, right? And so now here's a question. It's like, how in the world would Matthew have any idea what is being said to Herod's servants? Like, he's not there, right? I mean, we're just going to say that the Holy Spirit told him or something like that. Maybe some Christians might say that, but I think we can do a little bit better than that. And so it says in, I hit back instead of forward. It says in Luke 8:3, it says that Joanna, the wife of Huza, Herod's household manager, and Susanna, and many others who provided them from out of their means. And so Mark leaves this, or not Mark, Matthew leaves this kind of weird question just kind of dangling out there. But then if you flip over to Luke 8:3, which is not like a real passage that people focus on, during their Bible study time, we find out that Joanna, the wife of Huza, was Herod's household manager. And so that's how they could have been, the Herod's servants would have been privy. They would have known about Herod's servants, asking this question and making this statement. And again, it explains each other. And so those are just a few examples. Obviously, I have many more examples on videos on my channel. Anywhere that you go on YouTube, if you just look up Lydia McGrew, Tim McGrew, you can find lots of examples, Jonathan McLatchie. And so again, I'm kind of at a weakness here because I want to give time for discussion. The case is cumulative. And so you might say, well, these are just like a few examples. Definitely go out, check out the argument for yourself, because it's the cumulativeness that I think where it has the real force. And so without further ado, John, all right, what do you think, man? What's your thoughts? I know you got them.
Yeah, I do. So I guess we could start back at the very beginning with the feeding of the 5,000, and I believe you started with explaining that it had been done near Bethsaida,
right?
And you said that the fact that some of the Gospels specifically mention Bethsaida,
Luke does.
Well, if I'm not mistaken, Mark does as well. Does it not?
I don't think so. No, I can look it up real quick though. Keep talking. I'm looking it up while we speak.
Well, so my main issue with undesigned coincidences in general, and especially this whole where did the feeding of the 5,000 happen, is the fact that the way in which the Gospels were written, that you have later Gospels directly copying early Gospels and then changing some things. And so my issue lies in determining when are they referencing eyewitness accounts versus just copying or redacting rather and making stuff up.
Right.
Like I don't see any good criteria within undesigned coincidences to discern between that, because I mean, we know that the gospel authors copied previous gospels. We know that they had authorial license. We know that they changed things. In the Gospel of John, John extends Jesus's ministry from just a 1-year thing to a full 3 years of his ministry. And so it seems to me like, as you look at the Gospels, how we know that or the timeline in which we know that they were written, it makes a lot of sense that by the time that you get to these supposed coincidences, as you say, it seems like the authors would have known what the previous authors wrote, and they worked that into like what they were writing. Like they're just simply writing for the audience that they're speaking to. And so like this audience that they're speaking to knows that that at least one of these, as far as Mark goes, there's 2 feeding of a lot of people. And I think only one of them's 5,000, but it happens near Bethsaida. And then you have Matthew and Luke, and then subsequently John, who all have this taking place at Bethsaida in one way or another. And so it seems to me like it was established early on, and then working through it, it seems like the authors just sort of stuck with that one thing, but they mention it in different ways.
Yeah, well, it is only Luke who mentions where the feeding of the 5,000 was in Bethsaida. If you can find like a reference, I definitely don't see one. And I think you said a couple of things here that I want to maybe kind of help you understand. Is that the first one I think is probably the one that is most important, and the one that keeps bringing up over and over and over again. When you talk about undesigned coincidences, people are just like, well, whoa, don't you understand? We have the synoptic problem, and obviously that Mark came first, and then Matthew and Luke copied Mark, and then they had some of their own material that was original. Maybe they got it from a hypothetical document like Q or something else like that. And so where the confusion comes is that I'm not saying, Lydia McGrew isn't saying, the McGrews, Jonathan McLatchie, are not saying, well, all four gospels are completely independent, right? That would be like a huge straw man. In Hidden Plain View, Lydia McGrew is very specific in addressing the synoptic problem. She talks about it in her other books. She has a video titled What I Think About the Synoptic Problem that people can go and check out. Just Google or search it in YouTube. It'll come right up. And so that's not what we're saying. That's like some kind of hyper fundamentalism weirdness going on there. But we're also not saying that they're totally dependent in the sense that like that everything came from Mark and then maybe this other source Q, and then John is just doing some weird stuff way over here in left field. Okay, I think that's a mistake too. I think it's like a false dilemma. The Gospels could be partially dependent and partially independent, and where they diverge. And so from Mark, for example. And so it doesn't mean that just because that they're saying something different, that, well, they must be inventing that, or they must be just making something up for some literary purpose, some theological purpose, some embellishment purpose, just because they're taking a story that is in Mark's gospel and now they're adding some different phrases of their own. That doesn't mean that they're just making something up or pulling something out of thin air. They could have other independent information that supplements that. And so it's kind of black and white thinking to just be like, well, it's got to be this way or it's got to be this way. They could have other information from eyewitnesses or maybe being present themselves that they're bringing to the table in addition. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, but I do want to emphasize that what my actual problem was that there's in the whole undesigned coincidences hypothesis, there's no good criteria for determining between those two. I see those two as equally likely. Like it's equally likely that they just redacted. And for the sake of the argument, rather, I guess I should to be more specific, for the sake of the argument or the discussion that we're having right now, they're equally likely. So, what kind of what criteria would allow us to discern between these supposed true facts and stuff that was copied, redacted, or just blatantly fabricated? How would we know between those? But also, I do want to point out that Mark does place the feeding of the 5,000 at Bethsaida on Mark 6, verse 45. It says, immediately, and this is immediately after the feeding, Jesus made his disciples get in the boat and go on ahead of him to Bethsaida, where he dismissed the crowd, while he dismissed the crowd. It's definitely connected to Bethsaida, and it's the perception here is that it's at least close enough to Bethsaida for Jesus to be like, hey, go to this close town, kind of thing.
If anything, people bring that one up as actually a contradiction and just confirmatory of what I'm saying. Now there are ways around that. I think it's actually a reconcilable variation. I will refer people to Jonathan McLatchie's article regarding the feeding of the 5,000. Just Google Jonathan McLatchie feeding of the 5,000. He actually explains that as well as I think Lydia McGrew has a blog post on that. But actually people use that to say that it's a contradiction. Now, I could just say that Mark necessarily wasn't an eyewitness and maybe he made a mistake there. That would probably be a problem for inerrancy, but that wouldn't necessarily be a problem for the argument from undesigned coincidences. And so as far as an independent criteria or something like that in order to judge this kind of a thing, this is where I think a lot of people make mistakes, is that they don't appreciate the casualness of these particular remarks in the Gospels, right? And so, I mean, you're talking about just small, minute details like green grass and the Passover, what time of year it was, and a disciple named Philip, right? Or what Herod said to his servants, and then we find out in passing later that Joanna is the wife of Huzzah, who's Herod's household manager, right? These are very casual, small, minute details. It's not like they're thinking like, oh, okay, wait a second. Okay, so Matthew said this thing, and I better make something up here in order to like fix this for Matthew, but I'm not going to make draw any attention to it. I'm going to be really coy. I'm going to be really sly. And so when you say that they have like equal probability, I would just say that that hypothesis, because of the casualness and because of there's like no attention drawn to it whatsoever, and it doesn't seem like it looks more like testimony than it does like serious redaction, like Luke is trying to cover Matthew's butt or something like that. And the fact that these crisscross all throughout the different documents, it makes it more probable on the hypothesis that this is eyewitness testimony, I would say, than it is something like redaction or other particular theories that people have posed. And to say, even if what my explanation is like, maybe you think it's improbable, I would just say that I think it's not equally probable. I'd say it's more improbable. And when you add those things together, well, all of a sudden the ratio starts to add up, and the cumulative force of the evidence kind of would carry the day. I could unpack that a little bit more. It kind of gets into some nerdy number stuff, but so yeah, does that make sense?
Well, I mean, I understand what you're saying, but it doesn't make sense in that, you know, it doesn't make sense with the evidence that we have, because, like, for instance, with the whole Passover thing, it doesn't make sense for the feeding of the 5,000 to be placed at the Passover in Mark's gospel. Because for instance, it doesn't make sense in Mark's gospel during the feeding of the 5,000 for the disciples to be like, come on, Jesus, let's dismiss these people so that they can go into the closest town and eat, which I'm guessing might be Bethsaida or something like that. I'm not sure, but like, why don't you dismiss them so that they can go and get their own food, so we don't have to provide food? This wouldn't make a lot of sense if this was Passover time. And maybe McLatchie has covered this in his blog article or whatnot, but there's that. Then there's the green grass, which at this.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say, at this point in time, in order to make the connection that, because I believe it was Mark that mentions the green grass.
Yes.
Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's correct.
I mean, it kind of seems like you're saying, well, since they're mentioning green grass, that means it happens at Passover because of what occurs later in the Gospels. But I mean, green grass was around that area for a good portion of the year during the time in which Jesus would have been doing this if he had actually done it. So it seems rather very speculative to say, oh, well, that must mean it was around this date, when it could have literally happened almost any other time.
Sure. What I'm saying, this is a probabilistic argument. Oh, there you are. So blinked out there for a second. It's a probabilistic argument. Nobody's saying like this one thing, bam, it proves it's a slam dunk, right? This is probabilistic. Second of all, it's John who talks about it being Passover. It's Matthew who says that the crowds were coming and going and they could find no leisure to eat. And so John's explanation, John is providing a detail that it's Passover. And we know from Josephus that like, he says like millions of people would descend upon the area at that time. He could be exaggerating a little bit here. Let's just say it's hundreds of thousands. Well, that's a lot of people. That explains why there's all this hustle and bustle. But Mark is not talking about Passover whatsoever. He never mentions Passover. It's only in John we get this detail of hustle and bustle that's just casually mentioned. And then John just happens to mention it's Passover, but he doesn't even mention all the hustle and bustle. He doesn't even mention the massive crowds. And so that's how they interlock. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, I understand what you're saying, but for instance, the reason why John associates the feeding of the 5,000 with the Passover is to sort of connect, Jesus's sacrifice, him being the bread and everything like that. Like that's all supposed to be, talking about Jesus as the sacrifice. Like that Jesus as the Passover lamb. And like that's one common thing throughout John's gospel, is that Jesus is the Passover lamb, and he's represented symbolically in that way, not only in the feeding of the 5,000, but also with when Jesus is I guess beaten and put on the cross, because it's done at the time in which the Passover lamb would have been prepared. So sorry, you got something to say?
Oh no, you're good. You're good. I'm just nodding my head listening. And so
Okay.
no, you're good. No, I think you bring up a point, and that is something like, even I think it was on the Myth Vision podcast that Derek brought this up with Dr. Dale Allison. And he was like, well, maybe it's when he's talking about the green grass in Mark, he's like, well, it says in Psalms 23 that the Lord is my shepherd, and he makes me lie down in green grass. And maybe it's something like that. And so it's like, because I can think of a theory about the evangelist made up details for some sort of theological motive, which oftentimes this is just my own opinion, don't take this the wrong way, but it just seems like it's something that I can invent now specifically to predict these details, that the evangelists are just making stuff up. I don't think I think that's kind of textbook ad hoc reasoning. And an object listen to this. Go ahead. I'll let you address that real quick.
Well, I mean, now I don't know about that particular thing. I mean, that does kind of seem pretty speculative, the thing that Dale Allison said, but it's no, it's not like a new thing or a speculative thing to say like the feeding of the 5,000 was copied from the Elijah and Elijah miracles. Like those, like that particular, that like the miraculous generation of food miracle is a common miracle that was done by prophets in the Old Testament. Yeah. And so and there's actual, and when I say these things, like when I was talking about the green grass, I'm talking about empirical things that kind of don't make sense, not just speculative, symbolic things that could be or could not be symbolic. Like with the grass, it's a known fact that at that time, green grass in that area was, widespread, through a good portion of the year. Like that's just something that's known about the area at the time. So, saying that, this must coincide with what John says because of this green grass thing, it kind of seems a little bit cherry picky to me. Saying, this detail coincides with what John, who was definitely using Mark's gospel to create his own gospel, is telling us here. So it doesn't seem like an undesigned coincidence. It sounds very designed the way that it was. But also, we do know that a good portion of the New Testament story about Jesus is copied from the Old Testament patriarchs and prophets. So, I mean, to say that, this is just, speculative nonsense, to suggest that the Jews were pulling information from the Old Testament and symbolically representing them in the New Testament, that is a legitimate argument that is, in the mainstream of scholars, and it does explain a lot of the things that we get in the New Testament, like with the symbolic representation of Jesus as the Passover lamb, and how John is seeking to reinforce this idea at his feeding of the 5,000, and that's why John moves the feeding of the 5,000 from the lake shore up on a mountain. That's to solidify this connection between Jesus and Moses. And then he's got the, multiplying of the bread and the fish and everything like that. And that's not only to embody Elisha and Elijah, but also as a way to, emphasize that Jesus is this Passover meal, or he's this Passover lamb that's, a sacrifice, for their sins. So, I mean, for me, there's far more theological explanation that makes more sense than the undesigned coincidence idea. Because with the undesigned coincidence idea, like, you've got to fabricate some of this information. Like, you've got to fabricate the idea that it was, it's only green around that time of the year in Israel or whatnot. And so, like, all that. But to speak to your casualness criteria, I find that that's a little bit too subjective. Now, I get it that a lot of this stuff in history is a bit subjective, to some extent, but saying, oh, the casualness that this is thrown in there, it seems like there's way too much room for your own personal interpretation of how casual it is. And I mean, with the connections between like the fact that the feeding of the 5,000 is a copy of an Elisha and Elijah miracle, that this is due to literal like word for word copies of phrases that exist in both the New Testament sources and the Old Testament like Septuagint sources. So there's like this hardcore connection between the two. We know that the New Testament authors were using the Septuagint in order to inform them about Jewish ideology and Jewish lore and everything like that. So this hard connection in the phrases there is more than just speculative. Like it's an actual hard connection, and I don't find anything like that with the undesigned coincidences.
Okay, so gave me a lot.
I know
there.
That was a lot.
No, that was good. Well, I've thrown a lot. I've done the same, so no worries at all. So hopefully I can address all of this. I wasn't taking notes, so might have to go back. And so first of all,
I'm not either.
No, that's okay. Yeah, like I said, this isn't like a formal debate or anything at all. No, I think I appreciate the fact that you think Allison's theory there is out to lunch with a theological explanation. But then you made some other ones like, well, it's on a mountain now, and so that's symbolizing Moses. And I kind of found that one to be almost on par with that. No offense at all. But I did like your Passover theological explanation. That's probably a whole lot better of a symbolic interpretation, a theological interpretation that John would be making than the whatever Allison was saying there. And so the problem with all of these different things here is that we could just kind of do this ad infinitum. Okay. I mean, I could like tell any kind of a story from real life and give it some sort of air of reality. I mean, like, for example, Napoleon going into exile on an island, not once, but twice. A very clever biblical scholar could come along and say, well, clearly this is an example of a doublet, and the island is symbolism for England. Napoleon's enemy, while his escape represents a mythical trope of the hero escaping from the realm of the dead or something like that. You could look at details about Jesus sleeping on a pillow that you only find in Mark's gospel. It says that he's just this casual mention of him sleeping in a pillow. It's not an undesigned coincidence. And you could just say, oh, well, Jesus was sleeping on a pillow, just like Jacob was sleeping on a rock back in Genesis 28, and the disciples were afraid, and well, Jacob was afraid, and then Jacob wrestled with the angel, and then he had faith, and then Jesus spoke to the winds and the waves, and then the disciples had faith, and you could kind of go on and on and on and on with these things. An object lesson where people make this mistake and then later like have to realize like, that was dumb, was a French critic by the name of Albert Loisy. I believe he was French, and he talks about the pool of Bethesda, where it's in John 5:3. There's 5 covered colonnades, right? And there's disabled people, the blind and the lame and the paralyzed. You probably like that one because I think it ties into some of the mythology there. But he says that the ancients who thought they found a spring of symbol of Judaism in the 5 porticos were an allusion to the 5 books of the law, no doubt encountered the thought of the evangelist. And then, well, later on, archaeology has proven that, well, no, there was 5 covered colonnades of the pool of Bethesda, Bethesda. And so I almost said Bethsaida. But anyways, and so you could kind of come up with these theological interpretations. But the one thing that I really wanted to hit on here is that doesn't really even address the coincidence, right? You can come up with, well, this is why John was inventing this over here, but that doesn't have anything to do with the information that we have with Mark, and that they interlock. They just happen to interlock. And we could think of theological explanations, like I said, ad infinitum, but just explaining a theological explanation on one side with one gospel doesn't do away at all with the interlocking casualness that they have. And I think that's the main weakness and where people kind of run off track with this. Does that make sense?
Right. So as far as the maybe we could just deal with the location of the feeding of the 5,000, because it's a known thing in legendary accretion for previously unknown or nameless characters to be given whole backstories and have stories made up about them. We've been able to analyze ancient writings, and we have found this, and this is even in the mainstream biblical scholar stuff, that nameless or unknown, or maybe people that are named but really aren't given any kind of backstory are later found to be given backstories, or even sometimes whole stories made about them. That's exactly what John was doing. John was creating stories for this disciple Philip, and so he had Philip come from Bethsaida because in the story of the feeding of the 5,000, he asked Philip or whatever because he's from Bethsaida. John, the author of the Gospel of John, knows that the feeding of the 5,000 takes place at least somewhere near Bethsaida, due to the fact that he has Mark, Matthew, and Luke that he's using in order to compose his gospel. And so that just becomes another story that he makes up about Philip. I'm not trying to make this sound like I'm saying that this is like 100% what happened.
Sure.
I'm providing what I'm trying to do when I give you these alternate explanations.
Sure.
Is saying, well, this is an alternate explanation that also explains all of the evidence that we have. And if we have that, what do we have to discern between that and the undesigned coincidence that we have some kind of unnamed eyewitness account that informed this part? Now, normally with histories, right, we have whole discussions on sources, why these sources are good eyewitnesses, and the authors usually take a very interactive role in their histories, and they'll tell us, well, this person told us this, or something like that. We don't have that in the Gospels at all. And so if this is an eyewitness account, I mean, honestly, we should expect the gospel author to tell us, well, who told us this? And the only thing that we really have is at the beginning of the Gospel of John, it talks about how there's a disciple, John, and this is his eyewitness testimony about it. And that's it. But I mean, we don't know who the author is of the Gospel of John. And, we don't know if any of it is actually the eyewitness testimony. We just get sort of a vague reference at the very beginning of the gospel. And so it seems to me like the undesigned coincidence explanation leaves a lot of unanswered questions versus the current mainstream explanation that the gospel writers were redacting, copying, sometimes making things up, or maybe they were pulling from another source or something like that. We simply don't know. But the fact that, this redaction hypothesis, I guess you could say, makes far more sense of the evidence that we have than undesigned coincidences.
Yeah, I would just strongly disagree there. I mean, because again, this is the kind of things that we see in normal conversation. And that's why you say, like, as far as the criteria goes or different things like that, it's based on what we do know, not what we don't know, which is how these things, how eyewitness testimony actually looks and sounds and the texture of it. And then it's the fact that just because, again, we can think of redactional reasons why they added like theological meanings. Usually when there's theological, like they're really trying to reference the Old Testament, or they're really trying to say something about Jesus, like they tag it, they mention it, they go out of their way explicitly. When John at the crucifixion talks about Jesus's not one of his bones were broken, and then he highlights a particular scripture passage. Okay, Matthew does this stuff all the time with the flight to Egypt and different things like that. Now you could say that those stories are completely made up or whatever, but the point that I'm making is, which I would argue that they are not, but the point that I'm making here is that when they are doing this kind of heavy theological like inferences, they're pointing it out. They're being pretty explicit about it. When they're just talking about what they're reporting, like they're not doing that. And so we just have to assume that's just kind of what they're doing from the get-go. And what I'm saying is this, kind of evidence counts exactly against that particular hypothesis. We can't just come to the table assuming that they redacted because, well, we just, by golly, scholars say that they redacted. This is the kind of evidence that works against that particular hypothesis, right? And again, when we can kind of always come up with a theological explanation for everything that looks like what could be an undesigned coincidence, that doesn't explain that the two interlock, and then it doesn't explain the casualness. And then the problem is that you have to come up with these rescues over and over and over again, which sounds to me like it becomes very ad hoc. And so I think that's kind of the biggest problem with the critics of undesigned coincidences, is that they just haven't really, I don't think people have quite grappled with the argument. I'm not saying you haven't, but I have not seen like a very, I don't know. It's always redaction, or it's always some other thing. And it's just like, these to me don't seem like any more probable than the hypothesis that you're making. I did want to mention one other thing, and then I'll let you respond, and then maybe we could get some questions, or I might, we'll kind of wrap up a little bit here. When you talked about the feeding of the 5,000, and it's just like, well, it's Elijah and Elisha, right? And we do see something like that in the Old Testament. Well, I mean, Jesus could have just acted that out. Just because like something is similar doesn't mean that like Jesus would have done something like that deliberately, to say like, hey guys, I'm a prophet, I'm even a better prophet than these guys. And so that kind of gets us into a discussion about miracles and different things like that. But I don't see that just because he's acting in a way similar to them, that gives us grounds for thinking that the event was just completely invented whatsoever. And so I just wanted to address that real quick. So anyways, I've given you a lot. Yeah.
Right. Ahead. Yeah. Well, I was just going to say on your last point there. Now what convinces me of that is actually Randall Helms's Gospel Fictions. I don't know if I've
heard of Randall Helms.
Yeah.
I haven't read that book yet.
Okay. Well, I mean, the book is interesting if you ever get if you ever really look into it. What Randall Helms does in his book is he looks at the actual Septuagint Greek phrases, right, and he compares them to the New Testament, and he can pull out exact phrases that connect, not just like one or two, but like multiple different phrases that connect the Jesus story, especially the one in Mark, where it first came about. You can connect whole phrases between the the Old Testament story of I can't remember if it's Elisha or Elijah. It might have been Elisha. But he connects whole phrases. He also connects the progression of events. Like if you lay out the progression of events are exactly the same in both stories, which is an indication of copying and changing, parallel of a parallel happening. With the fact that there are whole phrases that are copied, the fact that the events that took place in the Old Testament happened in the exact same order, in the exact same progression, and everything like that in the New Testament, all of those, that cumulatively leads us to believe that there's no way that these stories are distinct from one another. Now, it's important to know that this is just the story that we know in the Gospels. I mean, for all I know, Jesus could have come by and done some kind of magic trick where he produced a whole bunch of loaves of bread and fish, like any illusionist would, and convince people that this happens. But the stories that we have as they are written in the Gospels, those are definitely inspired and connected to the Old Testament, which kind of obfuscates any kind of real historical event that could have happened. Because then it's like, well, we don't know. How would we know that this actually happened if the only sources that we have on this very obviously copied and changed stories from the Old Testament that they already knew and just sort of pasted them on top of this Jesus character? There's no way for us to know that, this story actually happened because of that fact. So it's not just speculatively saying, oh, well, something similar happened in the Old Testament, so that means that they just used it for the New Testament. What we're talking about is doing like an actual textual analysis, comparing the two stories, comparing the progression of events, and comparing Greek phrases that appear in both that are exactly the same. So it's a little bit more harder of evidence than just the casualness criteria. I feel like the casualness criteria involves a little bit more subjective like interpretation as to how casual these are, because I understand that you find them to be very casual references, but when I look at them, I don't see casual references. What I see are crafted stories that the authors use in order to tell the story that they wanted to. Like they wanted to tell this story in the way that they did, so they changed the stories around. They redacted previous gospels, that sometimes they even made up information in order to tell the story that they wanted to. And so that's why it doesn't seem casual to me, because it seems crafted specifically to tell that story that they wanted to.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is just where we would disagree. I mean, I would say that the point is that they do fit together in casual ways, and it is better explained if the recounted events are rooted in truth, rather than one gospel author taking his cues from another, especially about small things like an obscure disciple named Philip, or the grass was green, or what time of year it was, or who were the household, what the household servants heard, or that Joanna just happens to be married to Huzo, who's Herod's household manager. And again, this is a cumulative case. We've only given several examples. And so it's kind of like when you just over and over, you see these different examples, and I don't think they're as well accounted for on redaction as they are on the hypothesis that it's based on eyewitness testimony. I mean, even if the probability of the evidence that I'm giving here is like 0.2, and the probability of the evidence on the negation of the hypothesis, like say at redaction or something else, is 0.1, that's still a 2-to-1 ratio. So if you have 10 pieces of evidence go through, that would have a cumulative power of 1,000 to 1 as terms of explanatory power of a hypothesis. And so I know that these are kind of easy to dismiss because they're small pieces of evidence, and no single one of them by itself seems to be of great weight, because it's just like green grass, like a guy named Philip. But what happens is they combine to create that cumulative case. And so, yeah, I guess I just don't see it as good of an explanation at all. The other thing that I would say too is if Mark, this is the kind of, on this hypothesis that you would talk about, right? We would probably find the most coincidences in John, since it's the latest gospel. We'd find very few in Matthew and Luke. And then we'd probably find like absolutely none in Mark. But that is precisely what we don't find. Rather, what we find is that the coincidences crisscross throughout the gospels. They're completely multi-directional. And so if it was the other way around, like the opposite of what I just explained, then I might be inclined to agree with you and just be like, this isn't a very good apologetic argument. Let's junk it, just like I would junk another bad apologetic argument, which that I'm willing to do. But I just definitely don't see that. So I'll go ahead and let you respond. And then I think we're at 50 minutes. So we'll take a few questions and then we'll wrap up if that's okay with you. So go ahead and feel free to give some concluding thoughts there and respond to what I said. And then I see we have a few questions that we'll get to.
Okay. All right. Awesome. Yeah. I'll just make it kind of brief. Again, just like with the whole casualness thing, I don't see them as crisscrossing. I see that, as the gospels progress and the story changes, we have these different stories, and the way in which Undesigned Coincidences tries to make sense of the stories as if they're all supposed to fit together. I think you kind of end up manufacturing, not like maliciously manufacturing anything, but like you end up having to manufacture like certain crisscrossing like coincidences, as y'all would put it. And so I think that it only looks like they're crisscrossing, but that's just due to how the Gospels were written, the details that each author decided to put in there. I just think that it gives the persona, I guess, of crisscrossing, or the facade. That's the word I was looking for. The facade of crisscrossing rather than actual crisscrossing. But ultimately, for this discussion, we both disagree with each other on it, and I think that we'll probably never agree with each other on the undesigned coincidences, which is fine. But I guess that means we're both gonna have to deal with it.
I guess so. Yeah. So I need like the Snoop Dogg, like it's the D-O-double-G. Anyway, so yeah, no, that's all right. No, I appreciate you coming on, GE, and having a friendly conversation. And this is, refreshing to have a friendly conversation on this topic. And let's jump into a question here. Caleb's got a question for you, Caleb Jackson, super chat. He says, can an event be both historical and heavily theological at the same time? Jesus seems to go out of his way to fulfill Old Testament archetypes.
Well, so I guess I have a different perspective on this because I don't see it as Jesus going out of his way to fulfill these Old Testament archetypes. I see the authors of the Gospels going out of their way in order to make Jesus fulfill these Old Testament archetypes. That's just my view of it, and I do think that there's the possibility that these stories could be historical but have a lot of theological, like a theological costume put over them, I guess. Sure. But the problem is that there's no way for us to know if it is historical because of that theological dressing that's kind of put on top of it. Like we don't know what actually exists underneath it, but as far as we can tell, it's dressed up as this theological connection rather than a historical connection. So until we find new information, at least for me, there's no real good criteria that exists as far as I understand it. There's no good criteria that exists that would allow us to discern from the theological dressing from the historical facts. And until we can figure that out, I don't think that we'll ever know.
Gotcha. All right, I'm going to throw this one on here. We actually have very good evidence that the Romans were behind the Christ story. What do you think about that one, GE?
No. I totally disagree with the at-will hypothesis. The what is it called? Sorry, apparently God is very angry that I'm saying all this right now. There was a thunder that just happened. Sure. But the whole Roman connection, I there's a lot of things that just don't make sense with that for me personally. And I guess, I'm now I know that I'm a mythicist. People hate mythicists. But I'm not what I would consider the crankiest of mythicists, I guess, because the crankiest of mythicists would say stuff like, the Christian religion was created by the Romans to pacify the Jewish people or something like that. I really don't think that. I think that has no historical weight behind it. Like there's no historical evidence at all that would suggest that. And there's a lot of questions that are unanswered by the hypothesis. And I think that the hypothesis actually creates more questions than it actually gives answers to.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, I think it's crazy. And I get kind of frustrated that people even entertain that idea or have people that even advocate for that idea because it's just like, I don't know, it's just far out there. So this one is from, I hope I'm not saying your name incorrectly. I see you commenting on the channel quite a bit. From Nadamos, thanks GE thanks for hosting JE, and also commenting on the cosmic boob. I guess that he says it's something on Facebook. I don't know what he's referencing.
Boob.
I don't know.
I must have commented on something. I can't. My memory is escaping me right now, so I don't know if Nitty wants to put that in the chat. What I was talking about.
Yeah,
but the cosmic boob. It must be. It must be something that I'm just missing. I don't know. Anyways,
Yeah. We'll let that one pass. And any of the yeah. Anyway, let's see. I think that's basically it. I don't have a whole lot. Hats off says I love both of your channels. Thanks.
mm-hmm.
Thanks, Ben.
He likes seeing us getting fist fights, I'm sure.
That's right. Hey, Ben, if you ever,
video fights.
Ben has responded to a few of my Acts videos, and so Ben, if you're open to a conversation, feel free. He says he does have a question. He's typing it in the chat right now, and then we'll probably end on that.
Okay, that sounds good. Hey, you know, I want to say I really appreciate you having me on too. I like these kind of discussions and getting into the nitty gritty details of like the Gospels and authorship and all that other stuff. That's the kind of stuff that I'm really interested in. So I really appreciate being invited on to talk about it.
Yeah, definitely, man. I appreciate you coming on for sure. And here we go. Oh, this one's for me. It says, do you think there's a middle ground between historical fiction and eyewitness testimony? And so, yeah, I don't know if I'm going to have like probably a real good answer for you, Ben, on this. As far as the way that I look at it is that when there's just a number of different lines of evidence that seem to point into a certain direction, let's say like with the external confirmations that we see in the book of Acts, which I know you disagree with some of that, or the undesigned coincidences between the letters of Paul and the book of Acts and different things like that. When you have a number of them, and they are constantly pointing in the direction that the disciples were close up to the facts, repeatedly like show themselves knowledgeable and truthful, then I would say that the more you see that, the more that I think that it takes the historical fiction off of the table, because it's showing you what these particular authors were like. And when they have this constant display of truthfulness, and you then at that point you're overwhelmed by the evidence and you go, okay, these are the kind of people that they are. All right. So they're not going to be schizophrenic where they're saying all of these truthful things over and over and over again, and then they're just going to go completely off the script and just start to make something up, right? That's like Jekyll and Hyde kind of stuff. And so I don't know if that like quite answers your question, and I didn't probably put that as eloquently as I probably would in like a video script, but hopefully that kind of helps. So, all right. Well, John, thanks again so much for coming on. Thank you guys for joining us on this live stream on this Saturday afternoon, and enjoy your guys' weekend, and thanks for watching.